Okay. You want to start over again, Ori? Sorry, buddy.
Good afternoon again, in case we cut out there. This is Ori Rinat from Atlantic Media Strategies. I'm here with my colleague Lamari Morales, our editorial director, and we're here to talk today about headlines and the ways in which the Atlantic's approach to headline writing has evolved, really, and helped us transform our engagement with our audiences in the digital age. The Atlantic was founded in 1857 and was focused on exploring the big issues of its time. It survived and really thrived over the past 150 plus years by adapting. But we've been able to do that without giving up on our core identity. Today what we want to do is explore some of those latest adaptations and specifically what drove us to reimagine our approach to headlines. We'll share some of the trends that are affecting media brands like ours and organizations like yours, and how you can use our tactics to better engage your audiences. So why are we even talking about all this? Simply put, the way your audiences and ours consume content is changing rapidly. The New York Times recognized this in their innovation report. Some of you may have read this leaked internal memo which exposed the challenges that we all face. The changing realities of today's digital engagement mean we need to work harder to put our work in front of our audiences. Certainly it never was a world of if you build it, they will come, and even today that's even less true. Chartbeat, which measures live web engagement and traffic across platforms, found that a majority of visitors to websites, 55%, spend only about 15 seconds on a site. That means that we have less time to capture our audience's attention. And instead of reading from cover to cover on a print newspaper, for example, or reading from a website's homepage and throughout an entire website, readers are wading in and out of information streams. They feel that if news is important, it will find them. We have here some really interesting data from a Pew study that looked at media habits of various audiences. And what the study found is that while users used to report checking news at regular times, we've now moved into an era where people are getting their news throughout the day, from time to time, and expecting that information will be pushed to them. The way Zach Seward, an editor at Quartz, one of our publications, recently put it is, people are living in streams. Our job is simply to find a way into those streams. And so readers have found smarter and easier ways to filter the content they want. There's a great quote here from a House of Representatives legislative assistant that talks about how this person uses their Outlook inbox as the main way to find information, expecting things to come to them, but not even being willing to open up attachments, expecting easy to access information. And so in this era, as Sean mentioned at the beginning, side door website visits, people coming directly to an article and rather than coming to a homepage, are the norm. In 2012, 34% of visits to nationaljournal.com started on the homepage. In 2014, that number was down to almost 7%. We used to live in a world where people started on the homepage. They navigated to NewYorkTimes.com or TheAtlantic.com or to the homepage of Pew or the Red Cross. And sure, some visits came from search, but for the most part, people began engaging at the homepage. Today, almost no visits start on the homepage. We see this with National Journal, as I mentioned, and with our other publications. Instead, social is usually the largest driver of traffic. Referrals from other sites and search also play a role as well. And when people come from all of these locations, they land directly on a piece of content. I want to talk briefly about the concept of dark social. Dark social is a term that was first coined by Alexis Madrigal, the Atlantic's former tech editor. And it's a term that refers to all the social traffic you can't measure, and that instead we miscategorize as direct traffic. Because of this, we actually perceive and underestimate the amount of social traffic that's coming to our websites. A significant portion of traffic coming to Atlantic media sites and to your own may be showing up in our analytics tools as coming directly to the site. Your organization might refer to this as direct or typed bookmark traffic. But it turns out that much of the traffic we thought was coming directly to our site is actually social as well. Intuitively, this makes sense. We know that no one typed in a long URL, www.theatlantic.com/healthcare/ a whole bunch of other letters and numbers. Instead, they must have clicked on that link somewhere. But the tracking code that tells us where the user came from got lost, or was never there to begin with. For example, when users email each other a link, it's marked as direct traffic, but that is the epitome of a social share. The same goes for an away message status on your Google email chat or on your inter-office chat tool. When we dug into the Atlantic's data to understand what was going on, we found that more than half of the traffic we thought was direct, we were calling direct, was actually dark social. It was traffic coming from a referrer that we weren't able to originally track. And so the takeaway here, social shares, Facebook, but even more so email, GChat statuses, and other types of sharing we can't measure, matter more than ever. And so to bring it all back, what do all these trends mean? We need new approaches to content creation to break through the clutter. For The Atlantic, this means blending high-level intellectual analysis with more accessible framing tactics that work well in the social web. We call this the Atlantic high-low strategy. And the Atlantic pairs high treatment, highbrow topics highbrow treatment with low topics and vice versa, mixing various approaches to get people to engage with their content. And so we talk about this as, for example, a refreshingly smart take on Gangnam Style. And if you look here in the third article at the bottom, we have an article that talks about South Korea's music community, but in the context of a particular YouTube hit. Or, for example, low treatment of a high topic, the chart that should accompany every discussion of deficits. Here, while we're talking about a very important topic, budget deficits, The Atlantic was able to put it in a much more accessible context by highlighting a single individual chart. And so moving from overarching treatment of content to headlines specifically. In this environment, headlines are the single most important content element. They have to work on their own. They're not always attached to a print article, or to a full report, or to a blog post or a homepage module. Instead, they stand on their own. They're the most commonly shared element of content, and they travel across the social web, divorced from the content they belong to. Because of that, headlines are the way we earn the reader's click. And so what does this mean for you and for your organization? Just like for The Atlantic, the social web requires headlines that capture user interest and spark engagement. On the pages that follow, we'll talk through a number of tactics that The Atlantic has used to capture reader attention with headlines. First, be decisive. Traditional approaches to headline writing have focused on things like asking questions or raising theoretical issues. You see today on cable news a lot of questions like this, but there's one key difference. Cable news banners are attached to the content they relate to. They don't have to travel on their own. In print, same thing. But online, we need decisive headlines that capture user attention, and these work really well, especially when the claim you're making is relevant and significant. Quartz, our global business publication, recently tried this on an article about Black Friday shopping. Go ahead and shop on Thanksgiving. The U.S. economy is counting on you. So did The Atlantic, and here we actually tested headlines that posed questions and found that the decisive headline did much better than any others on the topic. You really ought to be more terrified of the debt ceiling. But I can't emphasize this enough. Only be as decisive as your content allows you to be. It's important to deliver on the promise of the click and be sure the article actually supports your claim. The tactic here is meant to help you create a curiosity gap, but then bridge it and provide the readers with what you promised. Another tactic that works well, and I should mention that the idea here is to use some of these tactics either individually or in combination, and not necessarily all of them at once. Another tactic that works well, creating things. People don't love to share articles. They love to share things. Sure, sometimes someone might say, hey, did you see that New York Times piece? But they're far more likely to share content when it includes and is focused on a specific artifact. Recently, during a court case involving Apple, a series of emails written by Steve Jobs were released as part of the discovery process. A lot of different outlets covered the case, and some of them even covered the documents that were released. But Quartz and The Atlantic actually took a different approach. They wrote a piece on the very unique and very successful negotiating style of Steve Jobs. For their headline, they zoomed in on a particular thing, the emails themselves. You can imagine readers discussing the piece and saying things like, hey, did you happen to see those Steve Jobs emails? And sure, when they're talking about the piece or sharing the piece, the emails themselves might trump the fact that this is an Atlantic article, but that's okay. We want our content and our ideas out there and being shared. Slate actually took a similar approach with an article about challenges in encouraging more girls to become engineers and engage in STEM topics. To drive home their point, though, they focused on an ad, a particular artifact in a specific thing. And of course, the Beastie Boys reference they used didn't hurt either. But if you look at the screenshot closely, you can see that the social ticker is counting over 700,000 Facebook shares when we captured this screen grab a while back. Next, make people feel. Emotional headlines work very well on the social web. By using an emotional hook, we can make our content resonate, and people tend to share things they relate to emotionally. We can drive our users to engage more deeply and then take that ultimate kind of down-the-funnel action of sharing. And this works especially well when the headline is paired with the right image. But I want to mention that emotional headlines can also be risky. Go too far, and you can trick your audience. And when you trick your audience, you end up making them think a little bit more negatively about your brand. As we mentioned with being decisive, the previous headline tactic, it's important here to ensure that the emotional hook actually matches the article. Don't use phrases like, you'll never believe, or the devastating story of. Let the content bring your users to the conclusions themselves when those conclusions are the right place to be in the appropriate conclusion. Finally, one of my favorite tactics, lead with a fact. All too often, and especially in a lot of the industries we all work in, we see headlines that focus on the general topic or subject or an industry or a report. Some of these headlines aren't bad, but they're often missing an opportunity to feature an engaging fact that will draw users in more deeply. Oceana, a nonprofit, released a really interesting study about seafood fraud. They wrote a blog post about it, they put up a video about it, and had a PDF report all titled, Oceana Study Reveals Seafood Fraud Nationwide. It was really cool. It talked about how across sushi restaurants and grocery stores, fish is being mislabeled. Why it's happening, what it means, how often it was happening. Quartz, one of our publications here at Atlantic Media, wrote an article based entirely on that report. It was a pure pickup. There was no outside reporting. With the headline, 59% of Americans' tuna isn't actually tuna, it spiked in readership and was the most read story on our site over the course of more than a month. Why? Because we honed in on a relatable, relevant fact. I go to sushi restaurants. I might not be eating tuna. I want to know what I'm actually eating. But here's the most important thing. The article backed up the headline. It explained why seafood fraud was happening, where, and most importantly, what you were actually eating when you thought you were getting tuna. Slate used a similar tactic on an article it wrote about the implications of education levels on lifetime earnings. It highlighted a pretty surprising fact. Skipping college can cost you $800,000 over a lifetime. This stood out in the context of the conversation. At the time, many were focused on alternatives to four-year colleges, education alternatives. But even more importantly, the article backed up the headline. It explained where the data came from, why it was important. These are our kind of four overarching tactics and some of our favorites here at Atlantic Media Strategies, and they've been really successful across our brands. But as I mentioned, a lot of these are about trying things and figuring out what works best for your organization and for your writing style. And so we wanted to share a couple of more you can keep in mind. Amaze or surprise. Big data can guess who you are based on your zip code. Headlines that combine information on topics that's relevant and interesting, but with a lens that might actually cause people to take a step back, that are a little bit out of the ordinary. Warn or advise. Buy experiences, not things. Articles like this do really well because people want to understand how it relates to them, and they're helpful and tactically useful. Be their everything. This is a great one, the complete guide to not being that idiot who got the company hacked. Again, this is more important here than almost anywhere else. Don't be their everything if you're not actually going to do it. If you're using the words complete guide, you better be providing them with a complete guide to something. Speak with your audience. The times of day when your kids need you to disconnect. Using words like you and your, using specific locations in your headlines, draw readers in because it makes it personable, relatable, and creates a tone of conversation. We'll pause there and see if there are any questions. As Sean mentioned, you could add those to the chat box at the bottom left of your screen.
And we have a question. Ori, how did you find how many people come to your website, to the Atlantic's website, through dark social? How is that knowable to you if in fact it's not knowable?
That's a great question. And by going through a detailed analytics review, we're able to understand the traffic patterns to our sites. I'm guessing most people on this call use a platform like Google Analytics. There are a couple of things you can do on your platform, and I'm always happy to talk through with individuals kind of how to figure this out on your specific platforms. But the simplest way is to look at traffic that's currently being marked as type bookmark or direct, looking at where it's going. If people are coming directly to an article page, and that article page has a long, confusing URL, it's almost certain that no one typed in that URL. That's an example of dark social. If people are coming directly into the type bookmark section of your Google Analytics and they're landing on your homepage, it's a decent bet that that's actually direct traffic. And so that's a starting point. Here at The Atlantic, we use some tactics that are a little bit more complex and that get at some of the issues, for example, with Facebook's mobile app. Many of you might have read that over the past couple of months, Facebook has been dropping the tracking code accidentally on all of its mobile app traffic, and so anything coming from the Facebook app has been registering as direct, as opposed to social or Facebook, and they're correcting that now. We figured out some ways here on our end to account for that as well, and the chart you saw earlier accounts for that.
Okay, we have a few more questions here. Here's a good one. Is the headline rule of 7 words or less now out the window? Is there any data on length?
I'm actually going to turn that question over to Lamari, our Managing Director of Editorial.
Great. Hi, everyone. And we will show some in-practice headline examples shortly in a moment after the questions. The question of length is a great one. Generally, there has been a philosophy that shorter is better. That is still true in many respects. What we do know is simple sentence construction tends to do best, so active voice, which is a subject, verb, object construction, the less punctuation or roadblocks that you put in front of your readers to help.
No colons? We love colons in our space.
So actually, in the data, there's no evidence that colons do better or worse. At the same time, for readability and that quick readability, any kind of punctuation is a potential roadblock to a reader being able to quickly process the information. So it's one of those things that you just want to use thoughtfully and make sure that you are actually making it easier to consume the information as opposed to potentially more challenging. Back to the core question of length, there isn't really a hard and fast rule on length anymore. Because of the internet, you have space to work with, and you actually see an evolution to a more sentence approach to headline writing. So you see that on one of our brands, Quartz. Ori showed you some examples there. Go ahead and shop on Thanksgiving. The U.S. economy is counting on you. That is more of a sentence approach to the headline as opposed to the traditional newspaper approach, which was a little bit more shorthand, eliminating of verbs to save space. You don't have that challenge anymore on the internet. At the same time, you do want to shoot for clarity and brevity.
Okay, another question here, and Luann, I'm getting to you. I know you've been waiting. Are there any stories where none of these tactics apply, or can you always find a way to frame them with one of these approaches? So does this always work?
Great. It isn't always easy to take every type of content and use one of these tactics. So when we wrap here, we'll show you a summary of all of the tactics we have walked through today, and we would recommend taking that slide, keeping it as a starter when you are working on something, which is to say, when I have that moment of when I need to put a headline on something, this is a great list of thought starters and ideas for you to think about. No, every piece of content won't be something that you can apply these tactics to every single time. However, we think they will work most of the time. And we also know, and all of these tactics are based on the performance of articles on our own brands or on social media more generally. So we do know that stories that use these headline tactics do tend to be more widely read, more widely shared. So it's a great starting point to jog your thinking about how to craft that great headline. And I think an overarching recommendation is to make sure you are investing time in the headline moment. It's something that sometimes can be done at the last minute. You're on a deadline. You just are slapping a headline on it. That moment can make or break whether people read all of the other work that you have already invested time in. So start with these tactics. As Ori said, experiment with them, see what works. And we also often start with one headline. If you don't see it resonating with your audience, try a different approach. That's another benefit of the internet over print. You can change the headline and see if that creates more engagement with your audience.
How often do you do that? Do you change a headline?
We do that quite a bit across our brands. We will see how an article is performing. Also, we often might have one headline on the homepage and a different headline on the article page. We can gauge the performance of those things. We also do adjust headlines for different social platforms based on what we know about those audiences and the types of nuggets that will capture an audience on Facebook versus on LinkedIn versus on Twitter. And on our own work that we do at Atlantic Media Strategies with our clients, we are always thinking about how we could potentially refine a headline, either to change it because of timing. Maybe there's another conversation now happening that we can now refine the approach to the headline to insert ourselves into that conversation, or generally to just, if we're not seeing the performance we'd like to see, we're always open to making that change.
So the rule is be nimble.
Absolutely.
Okay. This is Luann's question. Wondering if there's a team or separate group that comes up with the headlines, or does a writer or reporter at The Atlantic have a say? Like, take us through the process. How does that work? And I'm quite curious about this as well. Is there a secret team here in the Watergate? There have been in the past, but today.
There's not, and the approaches vary pretty dramatically. There's an editor at The Atlantic who actually makes his team pitch the tweet and the headline before they can pitch a story. And that's one approach. It certainly emphasizes the importance of headlines and ensuring that they themselves work very well across social channels. A lot of our writers spend time really researching these tactics within their own issue areas, and certainly in Atlantic Media Strategies, we do the same thing. We were working with a group that was focused on gun issues and gun advocacy issues, and we were able to find that across our own brands, for example, any headline that had a location, a specific town, state, city, got 171% higher click rate than one who didn't. So our writers take a lot of that approach of testing it, and they're very involved in the process. It's not separated out in any real way. There are certainly people within some of our brands, National Journal, for example, that focus on social distribution. Those are some of our brands where social is less ingrained in the process of the brand itself, and those people do tend to help our writers craft their headlines for social platforms.
Okay. We have a lot of questions here, guys. I'm going to try to get to as many of them, but I do want to get back into the presentation because the team here has done something really extraordinary. They've looked at your work and rewritten it. But before we do that, how do you translate these headlines to social media posts pushing website content? So in other words, is there a difference between an article in The Atlantic and a blog post, for instance, on comnetwork.org? Is there a distinction?
Great. So yes, I would say each of those, everything we do starts with know your audience. So who is your audience? Who are you trying to reach? What are their habits? What platforms are they on? What types of topics do they care about? We talk a lot about passion points, understanding the passion points that are already on the minds of your audience, and really crafting content and headlines for that. So of course we're talking about headlines here, but that can also define the types of angles that you choose to focus your body copy on. So yes, there are differences there, and then we do think very thoughtfully and strategically about each of the different platforms. So we know, for example, people tend to be on Facebook more in a personal capacity. So they are the kind of things that relate to your life, like the headline around when your kids would like you to disconnect. That's the kind of content that people expect to see on Facebook. They might be on there more in the leisure hours of their life, whereas when they're on LinkedIn, they are really there in a professional capacity, thinking through, I'm looking for knowledge that I can use at work, or to share within my own professional network. And then on Twitter, we know that things tend to do better that are very newsy of the moment. Twitter is more of a platform where journalists are spending a lot of time, and people come there to be able to hear directly from journalists or to get news really even before it's on other platforms. So we do think really thoughtfully about each of those. And then we also optimize in the back end. There are different fields that can be filled in for each of these platforms, and actually a study that just was shared with us from our corporate analytics team was that on Facebook there is an additional field above and beyond the headline called the share text, where you can also add some conversational language to draw users into your content. And content that had that share text filled out did twice as well as content that did not include that additional line of text.
So from what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm oversimplifying this, on Facebook you need to be personal. On LinkedIn you need to be professional. And on Twitter you need to be clear and concise and ideally of the moment.
That's a great summary of general guiding principles.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions and we'll jump back into it. Does that work for everybody? Okay. Here's a great question. Any examples of non-media outlets that are doing this really, really well? And I know we're going to talk about this in a moment, but can you guys think of an organization that you would point to and say, live on their website for a couple of days. They're doing it really, really well.
So certainly, and we will give a little bit of plug here to some of our clients. The Heritage Foundation actually does this very well, and the Heritage Foundation had a blog called The Foundry. It was doing well, getting a lot of traffic, and we worked with them to replace that with a new site, a media brand. So I guess this kind of straddles the line between media and kind of the think tank world. Called the Daily Signal. And the Daily Signal right now is getting millions of uniques a month, and they're really using a lot of these headline tactics very well. And they've managed to do something that I think is very impressive, which is apply those tactics both to their news coverage, and they have a team of people creating news, but also to their research team, and helped their academics, their researchers, their commentators, their analysts apply these tactics to reports and other content that's then being promoted on this site. So they're an example that really does stand out as someone who's doing this well. I think there are others as well. Gallup actually does this pretty well. Any others that come to mind? Yeah, those are some examples, and we're happy to share more kind of down the line.
Another question, and then we'll jump back into this. Are questions still a viable headline tactic? That's a question. Do questions work?
They do work. They do work, and I personally was a person who was against questions for a long time until the data, I was presented with the data. Questions do work. We like to, one of our recommendations is ask the bigger question. So don't ask the obvious question that might come across as a little bit, like the rhetorical question that's like the easy thing that first comes to mind.
Give me an example.
What works? I'm trying to think of another one, but will eating carrots really improve your eyesight? If you're going to answer that question in the article, that's somewhat of a delay tactic, which I think authoritative is always better. So because headlines travel on their own, you want the headline to provide value in and of itself for the person who doesn't have time to read the whole article right now. So it's great to be authoritative rather than ask a rhetorical question that you're just going to answer in the piece. That said, you can do really well, and you'll see this in one of our in-practice examples, with what is the bigger question, the question other people haven't thought to ask. How will technology alter, a specific aspect of our healthcare? Getting to something that if you have a unique lens and a unique answer and you are elevating and bringing attention to a question that other people haven't thought of, that is a great opportunity to use a question. So it's kind of, don't do the cliche question, don't write the news tease that, annoys news viewers. They don't want to wait till after the break. But if you want to illuminate a true question, that can work really well.
And is there a platform that questions work better on than others? So for instance, because what I'm hearing from you guys is social is really important, and so oftentimes people are never going to see that third paragraph, that 10th paragraph, that beautiful concluding paragraph that someone's written and crafted and slaved over. They are going to see that headline. And if it's a question, is there a place where those work better?
Yeah, I think actually Lamari said something really important on this point, which is being decisive is ideal. Asking a question is great when you're not in a position to be decisive and the answer itself isn't very clear. I think that's true across platforms, and especially across kind of the big three, the Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter.
Okay. We're going to jump back into it, guys. If you didn't get your question answered, I know there's several waiting here. We will get to them at the end, so thank you for your patience. But let's go ahead and move on, please.
Great. So Lamari now is going to take us through some examples of actual headlines from organizations like yours, and we'll show you how we rewrote some of them using these tactics.
Great. And our goal here is really to show you how the same exact content, the same article, could have be framed a little bit differently with the headline using these tactics that we've walked through. So we're going to start first with the Be Decisive tactic and looking at a story from the Communications Network. So the original headline on this story was...
Tristan.
Well, this headline has to do a lot of work, so let's take a look at it. Ex-Presidents and the Tweet of the Year, in conversation with P.J. Crowley, former State Department spokesman, part 2 of 2. So the part 2 of 2, let's just ignore that for a second because I understand you might have not have the technology to associate two related articles. At the same time, looks like you have a great interview and you want to promote that you have a great interview and you think this person has name recognition among your audience, so including the name might be helpful. And then additionally, we've tried to pull out some of the substance of what he's tried to say. All of it together is a bit much, and here you see kind of some punctuation, colon, it's a little bit just visually maybe daunting. So here we tried to use, read the article, and actually he was providing a lot of great advice. And you, in the content, had summarized the advice really succinctly, and you can see it right there in the key takeaways. I'm not sure if everyone can see that on their screen, but one of the key takeaways from the article from his advice was how you can use social media to set your own agenda, to break free of the news cycle and what people want you to talk about and create your own themes. So we thought this is really coming through loud and clear in the article, and that's something that we could use to be decisive. So if it was my own article, and it was my own thought, I might have just been able to say, use social media to set your own agenda and back that up. Here, we need to attribute it to our interviewee. So we've decided to go with one spokesman's advice, use social media to set you free. Here, the thinking is, you got a great interview, and your audience would likely like to know what spokesman, and so that might get them over the bridge and not including the name. An alternative there would be if you really thought most of your audience is familiar with that name, use just the name and not the title, and then the same exact tactic would work. What are your thoughts?
Well, I just realized, and I should make this clear to everybody who's listening, I just had a Brian Williams moment. I wrote this headline. It wasn't Tristan. He was too kind to correct me, but I wrote this. And that makes a heck of a lot of sense to me. It is a lot of words. It's a lot of punctuation. And, yeah, I would probably click on number 2.
Great. Let's try another example.
Great. So here we have, again, pulled from a number of organizations just to show you examples in practice, and a lot of the content was really great. We just really wanted to crystallize these examples with real-world content. So here, the original headline was, No Excuses, the Myths versus Facts of Building Livable Cities. We do have a colon, but generally it's easy to read. It's fairly straightforward. At the same time, in looking at the piece, it's actually a great listicle, and we haven't talked a ton here about content formats, but it was a piece that laid out literally 5 myths, and it had the myth and then the reality. So this is a tactic that can work really well because visitors do like lists. They like that. They think that they're going to get a lot of bang for their click, and they're often ready to go in. So here we recommend the change to create the thing is the myths, right? So 5 myths about city living that are slowing urban progress. And the idea is, myths by nature are incorrect, right? So the myths versus facts, we can kind of cover that by just saying, we're going to review 5 myths about city living, then I'm going to be more likely to click in. And then to Ori's point about people like to share things, not articles, this is the exact kind of thing where, I have other people who work on city issues, infrastructure, urban issues. This is the kind of thing I might want to pass along. Hey, look, they found a great summary of 5 myths. Pass this along to other people in your network. They did such a nice job of debunking those myths in an easy-to-read format. Here again is also some of that high-low treatment where you are taking a high topic of the city living, and actually some of the topics are potentially very big topics, but they've been summarized in a really succinct way, and so we have that high treatment, high topic, low treatment. Any thoughts? Great. Make people feel. Here we have an in-practice example, and this is a great example to discuss as well, as it brings up question, as well as long reports. I know in many of your organizations you may often be writing content about long reports. Either you're releasing a report or you're summarizing or having a take on a report. One of the challenges with that is when we're dealing with lengthy or in-depth content, we often land on very vague headlines that are too broad to be things or decisive or to be really, tactical or useful to the audience. We end up with one of the ones we talk about here is like the future of innovation. That's something that's so broad and vague that it doesn't necessarily mean anything to anyone. So it's okay to kind of hone in on aspects of a lengthier piece. And here we had this piece was about a report on a new paradigm for addressing safety, crime, and victimization. So the headline, the original headline, Rethinking Safety, Crime, and Victimization. That says to me, wow, that's a big topic. I might bookmark this and save it for later or print it out, but it seems like it's going to be big. Here, the recommended practice to make people feel, and again, this is a topic that's very personal. It's personal to our homes, to our communities, to our families. Drawing upon that for an emotional headline, and here we ask the bigger question. Is the criminal justice system hurting people more than it helps? That isn't an obvious question. That makes me feel like, gosh, that's a big question. I'm actually willing to invest time learning how I can help think about this question. And so here we've combined that emotional angle with the question approach.
Okay.
And then finally, lead with the fact. The fact approach works really well. Fact is a hybrid of a thing, because once you have a fact, you have a thing. So that's really great. And in this case, we wanted to highlight one that isn't a figure or statistic, because figures and statistics are absolutely great. Wanted to also highlight that you can lead with a fact in a way that doesn't necessarily have a figure or statistic, although figures and statistics do very well on social. Here, the article, the original headline was The Changing Face of Heroin, which seems featurey. It feels a bit broad. When we went into it, that headline is actually fine, and it actually is very accurate to the content that's there, so there's nothing wrong with it. But it, again, is a bit more broad and not thingy or have that share-worthy element to it. So here, taking a look at the content, this article goes in depth into how heroin first-time usership is up, and it's in demographics that didn't generally or historically use heroin, so demographics, racial groups, and as well as geographic communities. So here, there were quite a few statistics we could have pulled from, but this one was the one that encapsulated most of the content in the piece. And the recommended headline, Heroin is Making Its Way into Entirely New Communities. Felt that was a fact. It's really easy to process, and it suggests that this content has data and information that's going to back that up, which is the case.
Great. Thank you, Amari. And here what we wanted to do really quickly is recap the headline writing tactics we've talked about here. So we talked about being decisive, creating things, making people feel, and leading with the fact. Some of our most successful, popular, and some of our favorite tactics, as well as some others to try: amaze or surprise, warn or advise, be there everything, and speak with your audience. Feel free to shoot me a note for a printable copy of this you can keep at your desk as kind of a tip sheet.
Yeah, and we'll make a shareable piece of this for the network, which we'll share with everybody who's joined this call, or this webinar. We have a number of questions, but before we do that, you have a closing thought.
So all of these tactics are great, and all of them will help you get more engagement around your content. But something to keep in mind here, and this is a great quote again from Alexis Madrigal, is that when it comes down to it, your brand, our brand, it's an idea. And it's the brand itself and the idea that makes people want to click and makes them more or less likely to share. And so there are these moments online of micro-love and micro-hate is kind of what we call them here. When you trick someone into clicking on your headline with a clickbaity, misleading title, that's a moment of micro-hate. They come to your site, they're disappointed. It's not that they'll never click on anything you write again if you have a better headline next time, but they're a little bit less likely to click the next time. The opposite is also true. You give them a great headline and you deliver on the promise of the click, that's a moment of micro-love. They're happy they clicked on it. They'll forget it very quickly, but the next time they're a little bit more likely to click on something from your brand. And it's by doing this over and over again, by testing, by learning, by adapting, and by figuring out what headlines work best for your content and your organization, that you can really build your brand in this era that we talked about, where things are more crowded, where there's more choices, more content out there, and where you need your content to be found not just on your homepage, but across the web in all the places your brand lives.
Thank you very much. All right, we have a number of questions. Let's get right to them. When it comes to translating headlines into other mediums, what sorts of trends are you seeing with less URL-friendly mediums, things like Instagram?
So that's a great question, and I think here it's also it's a complicated question. Translating headlines across platforms is something we talk a lot about. Is the headline the social post? Is the headline the cover of the report? And how does the headline live across different platforms? And so Instagram specifically is not something our brands work on quite as much. And so we're happy to kind of get back to you on that and think about that a little bit more. But I think a key takeaway here is that when you think about the headline, try to, especially if you're only going to have one headline, and I know there were some questions earlier about the ability to have more than one, but especially if you're only going to have one headline, try to pick a headline that translates well across platforms. Think about its length, and if it's very long, is it going to do well on Twitter on its own? Think about LinkedIn, where on mobile and on the mobile app, things can be very easily truncated. And again, Lamari talked about making sure that the front of your sentence carries a lot of the burden of the sentence. On Facebook, think about how to use the additional space you have there. And so try to come up with a headline that balances all those things, or create one that adapts to those different platforms.
This is a very observant question, and I'm ashamed I didn't notice this, but notice that you are using caps on all the words in your headlines. Is that a tactic?
So it's not, and actually if you look back, and I'm not sure if we ended up keeping this here, but back here, what we tried to do is match the use cases of capitalization that were in the particular headlines we talked about.
It's not necessarily a tactic, no. That should be based on your own style guide and what you use. And actually somewhat related to the last question, though, is this idea of being as conversational as possible. So if you're thinking about other platforms like Instagram, really having an understanding of the right tone for that platform. And so, title case, again, to just be very, very clear, should be based on your own style rules, but you might want to invest the time to come up with style guidelines for different platforms. I know that The Atlantic does have that, so we have certain style guidelines for the actual headline, which does use caps, and I think that was us just kind of using Atlantic style there. But I do know that, for example, in that shared text that I mentioned, that is in the sentence case because it's more conversational. It's basically like a person is saying, hey, look at this. So you might consider adapting the style for different moments. And back to the Instagram question, people are there in a very kind of quick conversational way, and being overly formal on a platform like that probably isn't a good match. So, it would be worthwhile to kind of look at all of the platforms that you're on and identify what is the right tone and the right style for that platform, and then be consistent, which is always really important.
Okay. This is a fantastic question. Do you A/B test your headlines? And if so, how?
Absolutely. In a lot of different ways, and I'll give you kind of my favorite little trick here, but then we'll talk about some other things we do. The Atlantic is especially good at this, and we've done this with a lot of our clients. A/B testing not just headlines, but also images. And there are some nice ways to do it using great plugins for your website. There are some tools that work well with WordPress. But one of our favorites is actually to use Facebook and LinkedIn for it. And on Facebook, by spending about $10 or $20 on promoted posts, You can get actually an A/B test out of that, and here's how. Using the Power Editor tool on Facebook, you create two completely separate campaigns. It's important that they be separate campaigns and not two posts within the same campaign. You allocate the exact same budget to each campaign, you target the same target audience, and you set the duration of the campaign as just an hour. A great tip to make sure you're getting the most affordable traffic here is to target mobile users. Publishers want those less because they can't monetize them, but for an A/B test, it's just as good. So you target these audiences and you run two campaigns controlling for everything but the headline. Use the same image, use the same share text, or use the same headline with different images if you're testing images, and run those for an hour. It takes about another hour and a half, 2 hours for the results to come in, but then see which one did better. Make sure you're doing this on a CPM basis rather than a CPC basis.
CPM is clicks per...
Cost per impression. So you can either bid per how much you want to pay when someone clicks or how much you want to pay when people see it. Because what we want to test here is with the same number of people seeing it, how many people actually clicked it. And that's different than what we recommend when you're actually trying to promote your content. Run that test and you should have the results of an A/B test pretty quickly. The same thing's true on LinkedIn now, where they give you the option for what's called direct sponsored content, which is distinct from sponsored updates. Direct sponsored content doesn't appear on your organizational page on LinkedIn, and you can sponsor it the same way, creating an A/B test that way as well. A little bit more expensive, but helpful when you're targeting a very specific audience.
Okay. Do you repost the same content multiple times on Facebook and Twitter? I'm not talking about evergreen, but the same piece over the course of...
Absolutely, and something to think about here is the lifespan of the post on your particular organizational page and on a feed. So if you're posting the same article 5-6 times in a row on Twitter and you're not posting anything else, it might not get seen 5 or 6 times by different users, but when people arrive at your feed, at your profile page, it's going to look very repetitive. So it's a balancing act. On the other hand, if you're posting a lot of content and there's a good variety to it, feel free to post things over and over again. Keep in mind that one recent study showed that an average tweet is visible on people's news feeds for 14 minutes. That's a far lower lifespan than something like LinkedIn, where things tend to stick around a little bit more. There we wouldn't recommend reposting things as many times. Someone who asked the question here asked about evergreen posts, and there's actually a really great story about something we reposted. We wrote an article on The Atlantic, don't ask me why, about Eminem, the rapper, and a history of his altercations and debates with other celebrities. The headline was, "A History of Eminem's Beefs." The article did okay. It got about 25,000 hits. We reposted it later, a couple of months later actually, so it was a little bit evergreen in that sense, with the headline, "Happy Birthday Eminem, here's every celebrity you've ever dissed." It did 4 times as well, over 100,000 hits. So certainly repost it and try a different headline when you do.
And I would say that's one of the benefits of being an organization as opposed to a media company. Often your content has opportunities to be timely at another moment. So often you invest a lot of time and energy at the moment of a release or based on internal milestones that you have set out, but then you've invested all this time in this great content. There are other moments where you can bring that back, and it's absolutely okay to do, and audiences value it. I previously worked at Gallup. It was a great parallel example there where we published research on a variety of topics all of the time, but then there would be, let's take gun control as an example. We might publish some findings around gun control just when we got new data, right? But then all of a sudden there would be an incident in the news related to gun safety, and all of a sudden that research that we might have posted a month or 2 months ago is actually very relevant right now, and it's absolutely okay, and users really appreciate you directing them to that content that is actually, you've already published it, but to them it is what they need right now. And so that can be really great, and for organizations, you do have more than one at-bat at particular pieces of content.
Okay. What about updating your headline when you update your story or your content? Is that necessary? Should you do that? Is that a recommendation for you?
So it's definitely something to consider, and something to keep in mind here is also the platform you're working on. You want to make sure, both for SEO reasons and for social sharing reasons, that your URL stays the same. And most content management systems are pretty good about this. but certainly consider updating your headline when you change your content. As the story evolves, if there are new lenses on it, don't be stuck with a headline once it's live.
Right, and for tracking, it's actually great. So in the M&M example that Ori gave, there was the original post that had its own URL, and then there was the new headline. It actually linked back to the original post, and so actually then you can track the performance of both of those, the original post and the new post. So that can be really great, which is release it with a new headline. You might take an excerpt and then point people back to the original, and then that way both are still out in the world, both are dated on the day of their release. You can track the performance of each, and you haven't altered the original content.
Gotcha. How many variables of headlines do you guys typically test for any given article?
So it really depends on the case. And the Atlantic usually tests 2 headlines. They start with about 5 or 6 and then narrow it down to 2 they want to test. A lot of organizations approach it differently. Upworthy is famous for trying 25 headlines and testing 5 of them. I think something to keep in mind here is kind of the law of diminishing returns. You might not have time or resources available to test everything. Test your top 2. That's fine. And it's also easier to manage on platforms like Facebook when you don't have the A/B testing capabilities built into your system sometimes.
Okay. Obviously, this is a question that's been on my mind as well. So many media publications out there, particularly magazines, I won't name names, but I imagine some come to mind for folks, have struggled to adapt in this new era and, in fact, have either diminished or disappeared. How did the Atlantic adapt? Who led this effort internally? How did you guys get so good at this?
So I think this is a long answer, and we could talk about this for hours. The Atlantic's been around for a while, and I think that the key to its success and its adaptation was to stretch the brand without breaking it, and really test and try and adapt what it means to be the Atlantic while staying true to our core, and trying to create content that is interesting to people but still makes sense coming from the Atlantic. And the high-low approach we talked about is a big part of that.
Great, and I would add, I know there were some guiding principles around how the Atlantic thought about this digital transformation. One was, if there were all these new platforms coming up, all the organizations are getting all this publishing power. If we don't disrupt ourselves, someone else will. And so one of the guiding principles was, if we were a media company trying to disrupt us and take us down, what would we do? And that was one of the guiding principles. So to Ori's point about stretching the brand without breaking the brand, being willing to embrace this new world that we're living in and not necessarily be beholden. And I think some of the organizations that maybe struggled in the transition, tried to hold on too tight to what their way had been historically. And here the approach was, if we don't make the changes, someone else is going to beat us to those readers, to that audience. And the other story I love about the Atlantic's transformation is they wanted to grow their brand, stretch the brand, as Ori said, reach new audiences. They didn't want to be respected but not well-read, which can be the fault of elite brands where, people say, oh, yes, I'm aware of them, but I don't actually consume that brand. And one of the guiding principles was that they didn't want the Atlantic to feel like homework. And I think that you see as one of the things that drives especially a lot of the digital content that you see, which is, and this is something that organizations often struggle with because they invest a lot of time in long reports and in weighty topics, this vision that we could be smart but also be accessible and be something that people want to consume and enjoy and not like homework that you put aside but never get to it, was also another guiding principle, and I think you see that in the content that you see today.
And I think a lot of those lessons can really be applied to organizations like those some of the people we have on the phone today. When thinking about the lessons of the Atlantic's transformation for you, some things that really I think are important to keep in mind is don't try to be all things to all people, and don't try to do everything. When you look at a site and there are 8 different social sharing links on there, that's probably not going to work as well. It's very unlikely that the same audience that's going to share on Twitter is going to share on Pinterest and Reddit and Google+. Pick the ones that work best for you. And keep a focus on your users. Always ask the question about how your users are most likely to actually consume this content. If your audience is a Capitol Hill staffer, does a PDF report make sense? Almost definitely not. They don't read PDFs. Think about how not people inside your organization, but your target audiences are looking for information and resources from your brand and then match that.
All right, I think that's all we have time for now. This has been one of the most successful and certainly one of the best attended webinars we've ever had. So on behalf of everybody, the membership of the Communications Network, Ori and Lamari, thank you so much. Thanks everybody. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. This webinar will be posted online in the next couple of weeks, and with permission of our friends here at The Atlantic, we may get a chance to put the deck up as well. And look forward to seeing you at our next one, which will be March 11th. And we'll have information out to you on that very, very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.